Before I started hiking the Appalachian Trail, I really had very little knowledge of how difficult the different sections of the trail would be, and how some sections are a lot easier than others, and I really had no knowledge of the relative difficulty of those sections. Pretty much all I knew was that Pennsylvania was rocky and is known as Rocksylvania, and then I also had heard about the 100-mile wilderness, and in my mind that was going to be like a super difficult section. But turns out Pennsylvania really wasn't that bad for me, and the 100-mile wilderness wasn't super tough either. It was hard because it was the first part of the trail for me. But today I'm going to be ranking all of the states on the Appalachian Trail in order from easiest to most difficult, in my opinion. And I kind of took difficulty to mean partly how difficult the terrain is and the elevation gain that you have to do and stuff like that, but I also kind of thought of it in terms of how long the state is. So for example, I thought Virginia, in terms of some of the terrain, was one of the easier states and didn't have that many super difficult mountain climbs or super rocky areas or anything like that. But since it is the longest state at just over 550 miles on the AT, I ranked it pretty close to the top in terms of pretty close to most difficult. But I will be providing some rationale as to kind of why I thought each state should be where it is along the way. So I hope that helps explain my thought process there and what I'm thinking. So I made this tier list here, which just starts at the hardest up top and goes down to the easiest at the bottom. And I have all the states here that I'm going to sort into the tier list, and we'll just start out with the first one listed here and probably have to make some adjustments as we go along. So first up, Connecticut. It was 45 miles of trail, and Connecticut was on the whole fairly easy, I would say. There was, I think, at the beginning of Connecticut some climbs, but I think it was probably one of the easiest states. And I remember there was a section in, I don't know, the middle somewhere, maybe towards the end of Connecticut actually, where it was flat, like super flat on this like crushed gravel road basically, or path, whatever, along this river. And I hiked super fast along there. I was actually hiking with another southbounder bog balls at the time, and we were going together and just absolutely cruising like 16-17 minute miles, which those were probably some of the fastest miles I hiked on the whole AT. So we're going to put it pretty close to the bottom here. Maryland, I think Maryland was probably a little bit harder than Connecticut. There was the first 10-15 miles of Maryland, there were some rockier sections, and I was doing it. The beginning of Maryland I was hiking in the dark because I was doing the 4-state challenge, so I wanted to start early. So those rocky sections were a little tougher just because it was harder to find the trail a little bit in the dark, and I had to go slower because it was dark and rocky. So that was definitely a little bit tougher. New Jersey, I would say, was pretty easy. There weren't really many hard sections at all. So I'll put that below Connecticut. So maybe I need to move these up, maybe one or two. I'm not sure. We can adjust as we go. Georgia was definitely harder than all these three states. There were some climbs, and I think my first full day in Georgia, I had less than 20 miles, but it was like 6,000 feet of elevation. So that was actually a decent bit of elevation. So I'll put it maybe up here. New York, I think, was harder than Maryland by a little bit. There were some sections with some tougher trail, and I think New York was one of the hottest areas for me, like the weather-wise. It was some of the hottest times, I guess, hottest days for me on the trail, so that made it tougher. Next up, Massachusetts. I think Massachusetts was similar to the difficulty of New York. It was probably a little bit easier than New York, I would say, at least for me. There were some climbs. Mount Greylock, the highest mountain in Massachusetts you go over, and I definitely did some bigger mileage days in there, so that probably made it a little bit more difficult for me, but honestly it wasn't bad at all. Maine, I think Maine was the hardest state on the AT for a number of reasons. First of all, it was the first state I did. So I was just me getting used to the trail and getting in the routine of things and stuff like that. And so, the first 150 miles of Maine wasn't too bad aside from Katahdin. Obviously, that's pretty challenging. And then the southern 100 miles of Maine, though, was pretty challenging, and there's a lot more elevation, and the terrain is just rocky and rough, and there's lots of roots in the trail and stuff like that. So I think, given the length and difficulty of the terrain in Maine, I think that's probably the hardest state, at least in my opinion. And next, New Hampshire. I think New Hampshire is second to Maine. So obviously the White Mountains are known as one of the most difficult sections on the AT, but it's just not quite as long as Maine. And I think the White Mountains are like 75 to 100 miles. And man, once I got out of the White Mountains in New Hampshire, the terrain just got so much easier, south of Mount Moosilauke. And then, there was Mount Cube was like 20-ish miles, 15-ish miles south of Mount Moosilauke, I think. And it was like a little difficult and definitely harder than most of the other stuff between that area, but definitely not nearly as hard as most of the White Mountains. So I think New Hampshire is probably the second hardest. North Carolina, I think North Carolina was around a similar difficulty of Georgia. Technically, North Carolina and Tennessee are both, there's less than 100 miles that are solely in North Carolina and Tennessee, and then there's about 200 miles that go back and forth right along the border. So I just kind of split it up in terms of North Carolina being like 205 and Tennessee being 184. That's probably not exactly right, but that's just kind of what I did. I think North Carolina was probably harder than Tennessee just because there were some big climbs and tougher climbs at points, but it wasn't like pervasive throughout the whole state, Vermont was definitely one of the easier states. There were some bigger climbs, but we went up Mount Killington most of the way, and Bromley Mountain, I remember. And those were bigger mountains, over 4,000 feet, but they weren't super steep from what I remember. So probably put Vermont between Massachusetts and New York. So I guess I'll have to move all these down sort of here. Yeah, I think between Massachusetts and New York. I think, well, I don't know. Saying New York is harder than Vermont is, I'm not sure if that's right, but I think I'm going to put it there. I think I'm going to swap it. So I think New York was a little bit easier than Vermont. West Virginia, I think, was the easiest state just because it's only 3 miles. For me, it was, probably like half of that was pretty flat, and then half of it was uphill some. So it wasn't the easiest 3 miles I did on the trail, but it's only 3 miles, so I would say that's the easiest. And then Virginia, definitely the terrain as a whole wasn't super hard. There were some hard sections of Virginia, but I think it deserves to be near the top, near the hardest, just because it's so long, 556 miles, just about a quarter of the whole AT. And then Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania I thought was pretty easy, but it was just pretty boring. So honestly, I'm going to move a lot of these up. And I think, and maybe this will shock some people, but I think Pennsylvania was somewhere between, I think I'll put Pennsylvania between Vermont and New York. Because honestly for me, I was just cruising through Pennsylvania. I think I had a lot of days in Pennsylvania that I averaged like 3 miles an hour. It was so flat and just boring to me, honestly. And, Pennsylvania, the big deal with Pennsylvania is rocks. People call it Rocksylvania, but, most of the rocky sections were like fairly short and not super hard, and maybe it slowed you down some, but I felt like there were a lot more sections that was like super flat and easy than sections that were like rocky and difficult in Pennsylvania. So I think, let's see, I'm pretty happy with his ranking. I definitely think like New Jersey is easier than Connecticut, even though it's a lot longer or significantly longer. I definitely think Maine was harder than New Hampshire for the reasons I outlined. North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, they weren't super difficult, but they definitely had some steep ups and downs that made them challenging at points, I would say, and slowed me down. Especially, there's always big uphills in the south coming out of the towns, and I feel like I don't remember that as much in the north. And in the south, you'd come out of a town, like I remember coming out of Irwin, Tennessee after my resupply, and I just had a huge climb up these few hills or few mountains, and then like coming out of Hiawassee, Georgia, going south from there was a big climb up some mountains, and that was probably my hardest day in Georgia. And of course, that's like right after you have your resupply and your pack's full of like 3 to 6 days worth of food, so it's extra heavy. So yeah, I would say these southern states were more towards the harder end of difficulty, and then a lot of these New England states I felt were pretty easy. So this is my final ranking, West Virginia being the easiest, then New Jersey, Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, Vermont, Tennessee, Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, New Hampshire, and the hardest being Maine. So let me know what you thought of my ranking of the states on the Appalachian Trail from easiest to hardest. And if you have any big disagreements or some states you thought were a lot easier than maybe I put them out to be. And if you haven't hiked the AT before, I hope this gives you some insight into maybe what sections of the trail might take you a little bit longer or might be easier than they appear based on the mileage. I definitely think, Maine is the second longest state on the AT, but it's definitely the hardest in my opinion. And so you're going to go a lot slower in Maine, at least the vast majority of people I would think, than you're going to go in, a lot of other states, pretty much all the other states, to be honest. So that's my ranking. Let me know if you have any thoughts or opinions. And thanks for watching this video. There'll be more AT and, just general fitness videos in the future. I will be hosting a Q&A live stream this coming Tuesday, September 1st at 8 p.m. Eastern time. So if you have questions you want answered about the Appalachian Trail or my experience, you can leave them in the comments of this video and I'll answer them during that live stream, or you can just come to the live stream and send a message in the chat during the live stream and I'll answer the question there. I have gotten a number of questions about cost, and I did make a cost video breaking down how much I spent on the different areas of expense like food, gear, transportation, shipping, stuff like that. So if you haven't seen that and are curious about the costs on the AT, definitely check that video out.